Hi there, this is Penelope from Martinborough Manor. This is an introductory video on preserving or canning foods at home and the basics of this. Preserving your garden's bounty from one year to the next, knowing exactly what's in your food and making special gifts for a special friend are just some of the reasons for preserving food at home. Canning or preserving is an important way to preserve food if it's done correctly. So if you're thinking, things are getting really rough out in the world, so many things going on, I need a supply of food at home that is shelf stable, then preserving, canning is something you need to think about. Canned food, as the Americans call it, is only as good as the fresh product that you start with. When you're canning, select high quality, unblemished foods and prepare them by following tested directions from reputable sources. In America, that's the USDA or various extension services. We don't have those in New Zealand, but we do have access to the USDA material. There are various books. There's a well-known one called the Ball Book of Canning, but it's very important to follow directions exactly. In canning, food is placed in a canning or mason type jar, not just any jar. These have been made to specifically stand up to the heat processes used in canning, and they can be used over and over without breaking. The jars are sealed using a two-piece lid system, which consists of a flat lid and a ring band. The jars are heated to a temperature that destroys the microorganisms in the food. The heat also inactivates enzymes. Enzymes are the natural chemicals in food that can cause changes in colour, flavour and the texture of product over time. During the heat processing, air is driven from the jar. As that jar cools, a vacuum is formed. This combination of events preserves the food. The vacuum seal is what keeps the lid on the jar during storage. It prevents the product that's in the jar from becoming recontaminated, and it does keep the food, it stops the food from drying out. The canning method that's approved for a particular food depends on certain characteristics of that food. Foods are divided into two main categories: acid foods and low acid foods for the purpose of canning. Acid foods are foods that contain enough acid to prevent the growth of the bacteria that cause botulism poisoning. Low acid foods contain very little or no acid. The term pH, maybe you remember it from school science, is a measurement of the acid level in a food, or anything else for that matter. pH is measured on a scale from 1 to 14. The closer the pH value is to 1, the more acid the food contains. A pH of 7 is neutral. Acid foods have a pH less than or equal to about 4.6. Acid foods include most, if not all, fruits. However, tomatoes, figs, and maybe nashi pears are borderline, and specific amounts of bottled lemon juice or citric acid must be added to them before canning to ensure safety, that then the process is safe. Acid foods also include sauerkraut and naturally fermented foods that are preserved by natural acids produced during the fermentation process, and foods to which large amounts of acid, usually in the form of vinegar, are added. An example of that would be pickles. Foods are considered to be low acid if they have a pH greater than 4.6. This category includes vegetables, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and other mixtures of both acid and low acid ingredients. An example of such a mixture would be spaghetti sauce, pasta sauce, with tomatoes, meat, and vegetables. There are two approved methods for canning foods at home. These are boiling water canning, or its equivalent, steam canning, and pressure canning. Water canning, water bathing, steam canning, is used for canning acid foods. At sea level, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees C. As the altitude increases, water boils at lower temperatures. Since lower temperatures would be less effective in killing bacteria, processing time would have to be increased as altitude increases. Pressure canning is the only safe method for canning low-acid canned foods. When canned under pressure, temperatures higher than the boiling point of water can be reached. These higher temperatures, like 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 115 or so degrees centigrade, are necessary to destroy spores of bacteria that cause botulism, a very deadly type of food poisoning, as well as spores of bacteria that cause spoilage. Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria that causes botulism, is a spore former. When conditions are not favourable for the organism to grow, high heat, dryness, etc., the bacterial cell forms a protective structure called a spore. To destroy the spore, it takes a higher temperature than boiling. If the spores are not destroyed, they'll germinate and produce toxin in the food when it's stored on the shelf. When the canned food cools down, here's what you have. You have a temperature that is in the danger zone between 4 degrees C and 60 degrees C. You have a lot of moisture in the jar. You have no air in the jar. You've got a vacuum seal, remember. These are the perfect conditions for Clostridium botulism to flourish. Food can contain the toxin without any visible signs of spoilage. It causes a very deadly type of food poisoning that begins usually within 72 hours after consuming the contaminated food. Symptoms can include digestive upset, blurred or double vision, difficulty swallowing or breathing, paralysis, and eventually death. Botulism can be prevented if you follow the rules. The spores will not germinate in acid environments. That's why acid foods, or foods that have acid added to them, like tomatoes and pickles, can be safely canned in a boiling water bath or a steam canner. Spores are destroyed when heated long enough at a specific temperature. For canning low acid foods, the American authority USDA recommends a canner temperature of 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. Temperatures above this can only be reached in a pressure canner. Pressure processing is the only safe way to can low acid foods. Besides selecting the appropriate method of canning, there are certain other rules you've got to follow to have safely canned products. If the directions say to peel and chop, then peel and chop. If they say leave whatever whole, then leave it whole. If it says process 30 minutes for pint jars, then put it in pint jars and process not for 20 minutes, not 25, but how long? It's 30 minutes. If pressure canning in a dial gauge canner, your gauge must be accurate. Whatever type of canner you have, it must be operated correctly. You might need to make altitude adjustments depending on where you live. Your canner will have instructions for that. Only use directions from a reputable source, such as USDA, something like the Ball Book or the booklet that will have come with your canner. Don't rely on recipes from Granny or your friends. Check reputable sources before you begin. Canning recommendations have changed over the years as new research has led to safer methods. Canning processes are determined for specific foods prepared by specific directions for a particular size of jar. The process time is determined based on the length of time it takes to adequately heat the coldest spot in the jar. The way the food is prepared, such as the size of pieces, with or without the peel, etc., the consistency of the canning liquid, and the size of the jar all have an effect on how heat penetrates through the product. That's why it's important to follow directions exactly. If you add extra sugar or fat, or if you don't prepare the food according to the directions, or if you add thickeners like starch, rice or noodles, then the process time from the tested recipe as being accurate to heat even the cold spot in the jar may not be safe. Also, when canning, you can't rush the process. Heat up and cool down times are part of the process, so don't try to cool the canner down quickly by setting it under cold running water, as you may do or seen somebody do with a pressure cooker. They are different. This is a pressure canner. The method of packing the jars also plays an important role in heat transfer through the product. In what we call a raw pack, raw food is placed directly in the jars. Then hot boiling liquid is poured over the contents. Pack firmly, but don't crush the stuff. Free the bubbles or trapped air between the pieces of food. You can buy special plastic spatulas, or I've been known to use a knife carefully. Wipe the jar rims, add the lids, adjust the ring bands, and process. The preferred method of packing for most foods is the hot pack. In a hot pack, foods are cooked in liquid before packing. Then the cooking liquid's poured over the food in the jar. The advantages of this method are that fewer jars are needed. There's also less floating of the food because the air has been cooked out of it. The colour and the flavour are better retained, and the food's easier to pack in the jars because they're more pliable. Always follow the directions for the specific type of pack called for in the recipe. When filling the jars, it's really important not to overfill. We call the space at the top of the jar, between the top of the food and the bottom of the lid, the headspace. Check the directions in the recipe for the correct amount of headspace called for. For jellies and jams, it's usually 1/4 inch. For acid foods, tomatoes and pickles, 1/2 inch. For low acid food like vegetables, meats and mixtures of acid and low foods, it's usually 1 inch or 3 centimetres. What happens if you don't leave the correct headspace? Well, if there's too little, food may bubble out or run over during processing. Then deposits of whatever's coming out on the rim may keep the jar from sealing properly. If there's too much headspace, the food at the top of the jar is likely to discolour during storage, and the jar may not seal at all because all of the air wasn't forced out. So it's really important to look at your headspace. So, to prepare the jars for canning, you need to follow these steps. Wash the canning jars. Don't use them if they're chipped or scratched. Keep them hot until you use them. Prepare your lids and the rings according to the packet instructions for the brand that you're using. Remove air bubbles once you've put the stuff into your jars. Use a plastic knife or some debubbler, as they call them. You use the plastic version so that you don't scratch the jars. I'm a bit guilty of using a knife, but I am always very careful. Wipe the jar rims with a wet, clean cloth or a paper towel to remove any residue. Adjust the rim, put the ring on, adjust it until it's finger tight. To can foods in a boiling water canner or water bath canner or a steam canner, you need about 6 inches of water in the canner. Make sure you've got extra water boiling in some separate pot or your jug, just in case you need to add more once the jars are in the canner. If you're using a steam canner, that's a bit of specialist equipment, then you'll need to follow the instructions that came with your steam canner. The temperature of the water in the canner when you add the jars depends on the type of pack you are using. For hot packed jars, the water should be simmering when the jars are placed in the canner. So not quite rolling boil, a bit less than that. So simmering. For raw packed jars, the water should be hot but not simmering. If you're using a thermometer, this water should be about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is about 60 degrees C. This will help to avoid breakage. Place the jars on a rack in the canner so they don't come into contact with the bottom of the canner, because what this is doing is it's allowing water to circulate around the jar and helps to prevent breakage. If your canner doesn't have a rack, you can place extra ring bands in the bottom of the canner. You can use any rack that will fit in the canner. Don't put towels in the bottom. That's not recommended. Once you've got the jars in the canner, the water must be up to a level that's a good 1 or 2 inches above the tops of the jar. If necessary, to get the water to 1 or 2 inches above the tops of the jars, just add more hot or boiling water, depending whether you're using hot or cold packed process. Wait until the canner has come to a full boil before you begin your timing. If you need to make altitude adjustments, then check a table, probably in your canner instructions, and then make adjustments to your timing. After the process is done, turn off your canner, turn off the stove, remove the lid, being really careful to allow the steam to escape away from your face, and wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. While you're waiting, this is a good time to prepare the area where you're going to put the jars to cool. You'll need to lift the jars straight up out of the canner and place them on a towel or padded surface or a wooden board or on a wire cooling rack in an area away from drafts, because you've got to leave these jars for at least 12, if not 24 hours undisturbed. After that time, you need to check to be sure whether the jars are sealed or not. If they're not sealed, you put them in the fridge and eat them straight away. Remove the ring band for storage, wipe off the jars and put them in a cool, dark place. The ring bands that you've taken off can be washed and reused. For pressure canning, you only need whatever your manual says. It's about 2 or 3 inches of water simmering, again, same as before. Depends on the hot pack or cold pack, hot pack or raw pack, simmering or hot in the canner. If you used a hot pack, then the water should be simmering. If you used a raw pack, it should be just hot. You'll also need to use a rack in the pressure canner. Once the jars are in the right place, put the lid on the canner with the weight off, or the little pressure gauge thingy, open. The petcock is its proper name, open. In pressure canning, you've got to exhaust the canner first. To do this, you watch for a steady stream or a funnel of steam to begin escaping from the vent pipe. Allow the steam to escape this way for 10 minutes. Time it, 10 minutes. Then place the weight on the pipe to close the vent, or place the petcock on that, depending on what type of pressure canner you're using. When the canner gets up to the correct pressure, start timing the process. If you've got a dial gauge canner, you'll start timing when the correct pressure is reached on the dial. In a weighted gauge canner, you'll start timing when the weight rocks gently back and forth or jiggles 2 or 3 times a minute, depending on the type of weight. Remember, if you need to, make your altitude adjustments to the time that you need to process for. Once the processing time has passed, turn off the heat and let the pressure drop to 0 all by itself. Don't do anything that drops the pressure. Once the pressure has dropped, the weight stops rocking or jiggling, the dial goes to 0, and for some canners, the locks and the handles release. Wait 2 minutes. Then remove the weight or open the petcock and wait 10 more minutes. You've got to be patient at this stage. Next, open the canner, being careful to allow the steam to escape away from your face. It's really hot, remember, really, really hot. Lift the jars straight up and out of the canner and place them on the padded surface or the cooling rack, whatever you've got. It's really important at that stage not to tip them. Cool the jars as before, 12 up to 24 hours away from drafts. After that time, you remove the ring bands and check for sealing. How do you test to see that jars are sealed? There are basically 3 ways. The first one is the most exciting way. You listen for a popping sound or a pinging sound as the jars begin to cool down. Sometimes this will happen actually before you take the jars out of the pressure canner. You'll also notice that the lids will curve down or inward towards the jar and won't move when you press your finger on them. If you tap on the centre of the top with a metal spoon, you'll hear a clear ringing sound rather than a dull thud. Once you've done a lot of canning, once you've done as much canning as I have, you can kind of do it with your finger and you'll know that you'll hear the difference in the sound as well. If the jars aren't sealed, you can reprocess the food if everything else was done correctly and if you catch it within 24 hours. You'll have to start over and basically go through the whole process as if you're starting from scratch and use a new lid. If you don't want to reprocess, you can either refrigerate the food and use it quickly, or you could freeze it for longer storage. If the jars are sealed properly, store the food in a cool, dry, dark place. That means you need to avoid storing them where they're near heat pipes or in areas where they'll be exposed to extreme temperatures. For best quality, use the home canned foods within a year to 18 months. That's quality. They're not going to go off. It's just that nutritionally they will be better within a year to 18 months. And that's all, folks. The photographs there need to be credited to those that took them as there. Okay. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.